this was the beginning of my death, of my through-death experience, of my near-death experience. And the first thing that happened when I let go was, instead of being negative, it was this incredible, blissful peace. I felt calm. I felt serene. I felt a kind of ease that I've never felt ever since. It was sort of like the most perfect, sort of beautiful letting go release. And I felt like I was sort of dissolving into every direction, and it was spectacular. And then I realized that I was still conscious, that I still could be aware. And then I asked myself, well, even in this utterly peaceful, perfect space of beingness, what's going to happen next? And when I grew up, I didn't grow up with the idea of heaven and hell. These were things that were sort of like ideas that various institutions had, but in reality, this is not something that was believed in by my family. So the question now was, well, where am I going to go? And what if there really is heaven and hell? Or if there is, since I haven't been the best of all people, what if I go to hell? And in that millisecond, I entered my version of hell. And it was horrendous. But at the same time, I also realized, for some reason, it wasn't real. It was like watching a movie of hell, all the horrible things that you might have as your version of hell, and I had my version of hell. And you can read about it in the book I wrote about this. But the point is, I was in hell, but it wasn't real. And when I realized it wasn't real, it was like just a movie, like a story. Gone. Absolutely gone. And now I began what I later found out many people have gone through, was this kind of journey. I felt like I was sort of on a movement, like being on a ride. And it was smoky, cloudy, misty all around me as I seemed to be moving in, I would say, kind of a diagonal, vertical direction. I had no idea where. Again, I was feeling spectacular if I was feeling anything, because again, my body wasn't feeling anything, but that sort of the sense of wowness and okayness was there. And I remember looking to the left and right as I was moving, and what I saw were sort of ghostly images. And I didn't know who they were, and they weren't specific enough, and they weren't speaking, but I was aware of them. And I wondered, who are these people? Are these people from my past? Are these my relatives, dead relatives in the past? Are these, in fact, people from my present, but in another form? But I couldn't tell because it was too distant. So I didn't have this sort of direct contact. But there was no question that there were these ghostly-like beings that I was passing by. And again, in an utter blissful state, I'm looking at, where am I headed? And what I sensed was I was headed sort of through this cloudy mist into the cosmos of stars, of the trillions of galaxies and stars. And I thought and realized what is happening now is me, who no longer exists. Just my awareness exists, but Jeremy's gone. There's no more Jeremy anymore. There's just this awareness. And this awareness is about to become a star. And I realized years later, and sort of looking at this, that, stars are sort of the elemental nature of what we are made of. In fact, we're all stardust. Literally, we are all stardust. And this was what I was, if you will, returning to. I was going to be just another dot in the cosmos of the billions of dots. And this was perfect. This was ideal. Now, something happened that I didn't realize when I returned had happened until maybe a day or two later, when I realized, oh, this also happened. And what it was as I was heading out, suddenly there was this explosion. There was this flash. And it was a flash instantaneous of everything I'd ever seen, I'd ever heard, I ever knew about, every movie I had ever seen, every television, every piece of music, every book I ever read, every person I ever read, everything I particularly this Jeremy version, knew about history was all happening at the exact same time. Just like this incredible explosion of everything that ever had been experienced by this particular being was now suddenly being experienced again. Now, a lot of people I learned later have what's called a life review. This wasn't quite that. This was a bit different. This was sort of like an information review, meaning that everything that I had gone into my experience was being represented, and it was awesome. And then what happened was all of that snapped back into this sort of journey, at which time about to enter the consciousness. And then I'm asking the question, which I asked afterwards, who made all of that? And the question is, I don't exist anymore, but it all has been made. It's all been created. And for those of us like me who believe in the concept of a God, there was a realization that everything that exists is a manifestation of the one creative God. And that at this point, my no longer Jeremy-ness, just my consciousness was being united and blended into the very creative force of existence. And I was becoming one with the one that creates everything. But everything in that sense, even what's happening right now, is all a kind of illusion. It's the manifestation of the one and all of its complexities, all the stuff you see, all the stuff we all see and experience. But in essence, it's just one thing that has created the all. And I was going back to that oneness. And it was perfect. It was awesomely, spectacularly serene, calm, wonderful, and wondrous. And then the cosmos suddenly seemed to collapse on itself. And everything suddenly was becoming nothing. Years later, I've learned in certain kind of spiritual, mystical concepts, the idea that before anything was nothing, that nothing, in essence, sort of no thingness, manifested everything. So everything had come back to its origin, which was nothing. And at that point, as far as I can know, my, quote, consciousness was gone.
It was incredibly fast between the point where the mind turned off, then suddenly I found myself in a total void of nothing, a blackness, total darkness. But you got to realize, I had just come from a raging sea and drowning in a, an incredibly violent manner. My body was getting ravaged by the sea. To sudden quiet, sudden nothing, blackness. It was comfortable. It was calm. And for me, it was curious because I hadn't experienced this before, and this was all new. And I approached it with a sense of wonder, and like I said, it was very comfortable because I was in a very cold sea that was very violent. To suddenly, I felt I was comfortable. I wasn't freezing. I wasn't. My body. I didn't know. I no longer had a body to worry about. And so it felt like a real sense of wonder. Where am I? What Where am I? What is all of this? That only, even that sense of what's going on. It took me. I hate to use the word time. It took me a little while to come to the realization that I had died. It was just a realization. There wasn't a lot of emotion attached to the fact that I had just died. And when I came back, I was a little ashamed of that because I kind of felt guilty that, boy, when I died, when I first realized I died, I thought, shouldn't I have been worried about my friends, my family that I'm leaving behind, what kind of suffering or whatever. I worried about that when I came back. But when I was in the void and I came to realize, boy, I'm dead, I'm not in Kansas anymore. Or I'm not on the west coast of California anymore. Then it was a realization. There wasn't any pro or con type of emotion. No, it wasn't negative at all. And it wasn't fearful at all. It was because I was in this comfortable space. There was nothing there. And I've heard some accounts where people have gone into that and found that incredibly frightening. Now, I think if you transitioned into death in a very peaceful manner and you found this total blackness, I could see where that might be frightening for someone. But it wasn't very long before I saw the light appeared, and it allowed me to move toward the light.
I experienced the most fantastic event of my life and the most real event of my life. What happened was in an extensive NDE, what they call a near-death experience. I will talk just about a little bit of it because it would take too long for this. What happened was initially I found myself suspended and in a place where there was no place. It was just, I felt the presence of my body and a grayness or just suspension and nothing. And as I wondered about what was around me, I saw in front of me start to envelop this light that coalesced. Couldn't tell the distance to the light, but it coalesced as a ball. And I marveled at this ball because it was infinite. And it seemed to be the presence I was suspended in that actually took form in front of me. And I spent some time just gaping at this because there was nothing around this ball. This ball contained the universe. Somehow I knew that. And there was nothing, no dimensions, no time, no space, no thing. And it was not something my mind could wrap itself around. And I recognized in retrospect, it had to take the form of the ball for me to discern it. The mind can only operate with distinction, what is and what is not. And so it made that distinction for me.
And I'll describe what it feels like to not have a body, because I didn't have a body either. I was a floating sphere of awareness. That's the best I can do to describe it. But, you know, time and space are built right into our language. And so when I describe this stuff, it's going to sound like I'm talking about a progressive series of events. And it's going to sound like I'm talking about stuff, but I'm not. It's just the limitations of our language. So when I left my body, I didn't know where I was, what was happening. I didn't remember the accident. I was in the just present moment now. There was no place or stuff. I was in what I can only call a void, and there was no color, there was no light, there was no dark, there was no gravity, no sensations. It was nothing. And it was, I was really disoriented. I didn't know what was happening. And I still could reason. I still had the powers of, I was trying to figure out what was going on. And it frightened me. I became more and more disoriented and more scared. Because there was nothing I could grab onto to know who I am, where I am, what was happening. There was just, excuse me, nothing there. And the fear started ramping up and amplifying, and I got more and more scared. And it started getting out of control. I really kind of lost it. And I remember having this distinct thought. I remember I could still reason and think. It wasn't in words, though. I don't know how to describe that. But I remember thinking, I've lost my mind. I'm going crazy. I'm going crazy. That's the explanation for what's happening. And somehow that brought me a little bit of peace. And then my next thought was, well, if I'm going crazy, there's nothing I can do about it. And I let go. I released. And when I released, all that confusion stopped. Just stopped. And then pleasurable sensations began, and it was replaced. It started simple, like contentment and peace, and then that started ramping up and compounding and getting more and more intense. And I'm a perpetual unfolding of now, and I'm a floating sphere of awareness, and it ramped up and up and up until I was in pure, utter bliss. Absolutely beautiful experience.
I was working in the forest. I was cutting down a tree. I made a miscalculation, really grave error. And 5 seconds before the tree fell, I knew I was going to die. I just knew. And the tree just took off and hit me on the left side of the head, and I just went flying. What I noticed is that I didn't lose consciousness. I didn't feel death. I didn't feel myself dying. I felt no pain whatsoever. I just continued to exist. All I saw was my body. And then everything just turned black. I wish I could explain that void, that blackness. I don't have words for it. Other NDEers say that it's a void. I mean, it's a total void. But at the same time, I started getting this overwhelming feeling of joy. Just pure bliss. It's just happiness. Oh. And then, right after that, followed love. That feeling of love. A profound love. It was just so vast. That was the greatest surprise in my world. I actually live on. I am consciousness. I live on. My body is nothing. It was nothing.
The truth of the matter is that we know things when we're not here that we choose to forget while we are here. I make the analogy because I think it works so well. It's like when you're sitting in a chair reading a book. It's a really good book that you're really involved in. Somebody could walk in the room and talk to you, and you don't know they're there. Your focus of attention is not on the book, the story in the book. And you can get so preoccupied with that, you lose track of everything around you. You just tune all of that out and you focus on one thing. Similarly, you know everything about what your life's going to be like here. From beginning to end, you knew it before you got here, and you will know it again when you leave here. But while you're here, you're focused on it. And you're focused on each given moment in it. And when you leave here, it all comes rushing back, and you say, of course. Yes. That, and it's also simple. It's very simple. What is your life like when you're not here? If you try to define it, you run into problems because it is so simple that it's best described in English as this. You are. Stop. The minute you say anything other than that, you're talking about something earthly. We don't have English for other things. And probably more important, everything there is simpler than what it is here, not more complicated. At that moment, I no longer had any awareness of any of my senses. I didn't have a body. I didn't see anything. I could picture the earth in my mind, but I didn't see the earth. I didn't see blackness. That's seeing something. I saw nothing. There was no sight. There was no touch. There was no taste. There was no smell. There was no feel. Didn't have any of those senses at all. And yet, my brain was functioning. My mind was functioning. That which occupies my brain was functioning. And certainly you could still think in English. although English became quite irrelevant at that point because it didn't describe anything of what was going on. And of course, foremost on your mind is that all of your senses have just been cut off. Well, not quite all of your senses. Your sixth sense is still working very well. I say still working because your sixth sense is working while you're here. It's one of the things that you choose to ignore to be here. You choose to because it makes the experience of being here have more depth, more intensity, if you will. It takes on a more realistic look to it. If your psychic sense is working, if you're still picking up on what everyone else is thinking, including yourself, and what goes on outside this planet, you're not as focused on the book. So people have often asked me, how do you become psychic? And I just have to laugh. No, you don't become psychic. You are psychic. You forget that you're psychic. You let go of your senses here, and your sixth sense is still right there, and you have got it at all times. And it is not something that you do. It's that you stop doing this. So people look to try to figure things out psychically, and they think there's some effort you have to make. No, you stop making an effort. It's the exact opposite of what you would expect. You stop thinking about focusing here. You stop thinking about your sensory input here. You stop thinking about a whole frame of reference of being here. Meditation is wonderful for this. It centers you, if you will, in source. You let go. Basically, people, when they tell you to meditate, they'll say, you just sit in one place, close your eyes, try and just ignore all sensory input and say, I am. Excellent. That is source. Very definitely. And don't be too terribly disappointed if you find that you cannot turn on the psychic charms and become the world's renowned psychic overnight, because you lose a lot of depth of what's going on here if you choose to do that.
And at that moment, I felt like I was being pulled upwards. And as I began to float upwards, the feeling, I remember thinking, am I hallucinating this? What's going on? Am I going to float through the rafters? How does this work? Where am I going? And as soon as I remember asking that, all of a sudden everything went dark. And I was floating, being pulled here in my chest, upward, in a very warm, very vast, very dark space. It was a place like going through sky at night. Only there wasn't anything there, and yet it didn't seem visually dark. I could see. There just wasn't anything there. And as I looked up, there was a tunnel, a light, an opening.
And in retrospect, I'm wondering how the brain, the mind, handles seeing all of this and not being terrorized by it at the same time. And I wasn't. I had no ill feelings. And as I was contemplating that and watching what was going on to this person who's directly in front of me, I'm feeling this energy pulling me out and away from this room. And as I'm moving out, I'm seeing this blackness that I'm now moving towards. And it's surrounding everything I can visually see is just blackness. And as a child, I had a lot of fear of being in the dark and not being able to see any street lights or any light in the room at all. And so this was really big for me to see this blackness in front of me, and there were no other cues around that I could find. And I kept feeling this push into this blackness, and I just remember felt like arching my body to kind of try to pull back from it, but it just kept moving me forward. And as I moved forward, I could feel a lightning inside of myself. And I just kept looking and searching in this blackness for something to hang on to, some glint of something that felt comfortable and all right. And as I'm sort of straining to see what there is for me to see, I see this little tiny glimmer of light in the distance. And as I'm looking at that glimmer and focusing more and more on it, it starts to grow.
And the next thing I knew, I was in this vastness, this described in some literature as the outer darkness, but it was completely illuminated, but there was no light. And I had no body, but I had being, and there was no time and no space and no thing. I had no brain, I had no language, no culture, no heartbeat, but I could think better than I'd ever thought before, as if my brain was no longer in the way of my thinking. And I was in this vast emptiness that extended into infinity in every direction, and I could see in every direction all at once. And like I said, it was darkness, but it was illuminated because I could see in every direction.
The experience itself is actually, it's transcendental, it's existential, and it's completely minimalist in nature. I had an experience that, best I can say, is an exercise in duality. As it came flooding back in, putting it again back in context, I'd lost consciousness on the operating table. They were struggling to keep me alive, and next thing I know, black. I saw nothing. And the next thing I was aware of was the blackness was still there, but I was aware of it. And I looked around and realized there's no point in turning because I could see 360 degrees all around my body. But I didn't have a body. I was just a point of awareness, and I could see all the way around me, above and below. I had no center, I had no front, I had no dimension whatsoever. I was just a point in space. The space itself was more vast than the 3 dimensions we're used to here. I couldn't even begin to count them. It was like a barrel. We think of a space, but the barrel had no bottom. It had a depth that just kept going and going. But it was just complete blackness all around me, and the darkness was, people say it's a dark NDE, and they talk about the negative NDEs or the frightening NDEs or whatever label you want to put on it. This was the most beautiful experience in my entire existence that I'm aware of. I don't know if I had any before my life, but it was in darkness. And it's not a judgment or anything else, it's just, that's what it was. It was without form and void. It was completely lacking in anything aside from the darkness, myself, and infinite love. I was spinning, without moving. I was feeling like I had no point of reference. And I had no body. There was no mention of, there was no meaning to scale, there was no meaning to color or shape, because there was no color or shape. It was just infinite blackness. And it was disturbing at first, but the thing that balanced it was the love. The love that I felt in that moment of eternity was so perfect, and the love was completely unconditional. And it was more than I could possibly take in, but yet I took it in. And it was directed at me, and it was coming from the other awareness that was there. The best I can describe what I wasn't even a mind. I was a point of awareness. A mind has thoughts, a mind has the manifestations of the ego. The mind has so many things that we're so familiar with here, but what I was my raw essence there. It was beyond what we assume is our mind even. But I was still myself. I still had my history. I still had my my personality. And it was, when you, not only did I not have a body, my own identity was stripped from me at that point. I still had my personality and I still had my history, but what I thought I wasn't there. It wasn't along for the ride, but yet there I was. It was, again, very disorienting. The space itself was disorienting, and the environment was disorienting. But that love was what held through, because it was constant, and it was coming from all directions, and it was unconditional. I didn't have a life review, per se. I didn't have a tunnel. I didn't have a life review, or at least that I remember when I came to, in that, what I call the void. It could have been halfway through my experience, for all I know. I had just slept through the first half, I'm not sure. And, but I just came to in that darkness, and I was surrounded by this unconditional love. And I was aware that the darkness, not really the darkness, but I'll get to that later, was aware of me as well. I wasn't alone. The darkness felt like it was cradling me, like the mother would hold her child. And the mother doesn't look at her child, the perfect mother doesn't look at her child and see flaws. She just radiates it with love, and that's what I felt there. It was a very maternal aspect of God, if you will. That's the feminine aspect, the first part of my experience. Again, it's very dualistic. My awareness was also not only on the other awareness that was there, but the fact that I knew things I shouldn't know, or that I didn't know I already knew. I realized there was an awareness there, so I thought to ask it a question, to speak to it. And as the question came into my mind, I already knew the answer. And there wasn't even a need for telepathy, because I already knew everything that I ever wanted to know. It was just a matter of focusing on it. And as I wanted to know something, not only what I wanted to know came through, but the fully abridged version of it, with references to how that one little piece of the answer was fitted into the rest of creation. Every part of reality fit perfectly together. I felt connected to everything, even though I was completely in an empty space. I had no point of reference to where everything that I knew was, but I knew that every part of creation was part of me as well. And that connection was deeper than, I've likened it to a machine where each of us are cogs within a machine, and how the machine would never run perfectly without all of its cogs in place. And that sometimes comes off as kind of demeaning. Okay, we're just cogs in a machine. But no, it's each part is integral to the entire whole. Each part is the whole. And the parts in that darkness are so hard to explain. But what I did know, because I've lost so much of it. I think a lot of that information was just beyond what our physical, chemical, biological brains can hold. I don't think that information really fits within the three dimensions of our understanding of reality here. And so I just managed to pull through a little bit that I managed to glean onto. Okay, the cat's out of the bag. You know I'm not a public speaker.
Fine.
Thank you. The feeling that everything is important, everything is part of a greater whole, is something that the words just fall. They don't encapsulate how important that is, that it's all one, and we're all part of that one. That darkness that I was talking about was aware, but it was not a point of awareness, it was a field of awareness. It was the backdrop of reality. It was the essence. The darkness was just the color that was around me at the time, if you call it darkness and color. the darkness itself wasn't what was holding me. It wasn't what was cradling me. It wasn't what was loving me, and it wasn't the source of the information. It was that field of awareness. For lack of a better word, I'll call it God. Unfortunately, that comes with a lot of baggage because people have meaning behind that word. But that is the closest I can come to. It's a completely infinite in its vastness.
What is it like on the other side? That's something I get asked often. And it's very hard to describe because it's not a place that exists in words or reality. It is a vibration, a feeling. I often say if it were a color, it would be a light pink. It was a place of no boundaries, no edges. It was nothingness and everything at the same time. I remember that I was aware that I was awareness. So right now, if you were to realize, look down at your feet or your body, you can tell that you're looking out through a set of eyes. You are awareness through a set of eyes, but you have a body. You can look down and see your body. I was awareness looking out, but there was no body. So I was awareness viewing everything. And the most amazing part of it is there's no fear, there's no worry, there's no lack, there's no pain, there's no anger, there's no separation. There's only everything. There's oneness, there's love, there is pure, positive energy. It's just unlimited love is the best I can think to explain it.
The next thing that I recognized was that there was this pulling feeling. Even though there was no body, it was as if I was being pulled upward, and yet there was no up or down or left or right. It's very hard to explain, but there was just this complete speed about it, and these sounds that were like popping sounds, but they weren't external for me, they were me. So intense and so loud. I describe them like firecrackers and guns going off at the same time, so loud and just pop, 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 pop all around me, and this speed that the soul or this formless thing that I had become was moving through. I didn't see a tunnel. I hear many people speak of seeing a tunnel. That was not my experience. I went from this significant speed and intensity and vibration and this popping sound to nothing. And I was in this darkness. Everything around me was dark. It was like I was black. I became that. But it wasn't scary. It wasn't this terrifying, dark, scary thing. It was just like I had imploded into this color of nothingness. There was no fear. I didn't feel alone. I didn't feel left behind. I didn't feel trapped. There was no thoughts happening that I should go somewhere. There was no desire, if you will, to seek anything. I just became nothing.
And just like that, it was like I blinked or a lens came down over my face and I was gone. I was out of the room. Now, at this point, I opened my eyes in what seemed like a flash, like it was really almost like a blink. And I am in absolute, it's a void. It's like it's nothing, but it's everything. And this feeling that I have is I am in complete and total oneness. And in this place, this is where it gets really, really hard to try to describe each piece because it all blended together as one. But I had this feeling that wherever I was, one, I didn't wonder where I was. I didn't worry about where I was. I didn't even really have much recollection about the physical body that I just came from. I had a sense of self. I knew who I was, that I had an individual sense of self. I remember that. but I remember so clearly that I was a part of this, what I call a oneness in this void. Now, I call it a void, but the better way to describe it is like it's a void of anything that isn't complete. It felt like everything in this place was absolutely complete. Everything that was to ever be known all existed there. Every soul experience, every soul was absolutely a part of this, and any experience that any of us have ever had through any soul experience was all accessible there. And it was a place of absolute knowing. And just like the time didn't exist when I was back in the room, but hovering over my body, time didn't exist here at all either. But it felt like I've tried so hard to find the words to describe some of these pieces because we just don't have a vocabulary for something like this. We don't live our day-to-day lives feeling at one with everything. We don't walk past our mailbox and feel like we're one with the mailbox. It's just not the way we live our lives. So we don't have a real vocabulary to describe these kinds of experiences. But it was as if I was one with everything, and that there had never been anything but being one with everything. And because of that, it felt like, and it gave me this sensation that I could look through the eyes of every single soul that had ever existed through all time and through any experience ever. And that all I had to do was just shift my awareness to something, and I would be able to know it. Now, as I was picking up this like sensation that I was connecting to something so big, I wanted to know everything. I remember wanting to know this and wanting to know that, because there was still this part of me that had my individuality. And then there was this part of me that was connected to this oneness, to this everything. And I couldn't ask a question. No matter what I would try to do, I couldn't form a question. All I could do was be curious about it. And it feels to me that when I reflect back on that, the reason I couldn't form a question is because there, everything was already known. It would have been impossible for there to have been a question, because if there was a question, that would mean that something's not answered. And in this place, everything was answered. Everything was already known. Every outcome already complete. And as I was taking this in, I felt myself expanding, if you will, as I was taking in all of this knowing.
The last thing I could hear was my chest, my heart pumping in my head really loud. And at that moment is when something amazing happened. I went from this state of absolute horror to a state of absolute and complete peace. It was a state of serenity. It was just nothing to fight for anymore. It was just peace. I also experienced the state of absolute silence. So it was what I call the silence behind the silence. For me, time and space vanished, and I could be anywhere at any time. There was not limitations of anything. You could actually feel and know everything happening with everybody. And in, again, just a flash, I appeared in a realm that was made of absolute, pure, bright light. And this is what makes this extremely hard to forget, and is that for the first time in these 3 years of my life, I felt that I was home. So it was the sense of like, oh, I'm finally home. Actually, this experience was more real than this reality. And I felt that I was being welcomed. At that moment is when the sense of self started to dissolve. And I started to become one with the whole. Beyond this, I experienced what I say to people is the sense of non-self, or the sense of nothingness. There's no sound, there's no color, there's no movement, there's no meaning, there's no description. At this point, there was not even thought. It's like all that was gone. You just complete a state of oneness.